afternoon. Hi, I'd like to welcome you back, and I hope you've really enjoyed your sessions and we're still hearing some conversation. So my name is Paige Smith, and I'm the Director of the Center for Women's Health and Wellness. And this is a two-day conference, but of course, as has been happening lately, we're having some weather. So we've been trying to figure out what the best strategy is to make sure that we still are able to have a good conference and keep everybody safe. So we are modifying the schedule for tomorrow, and there are 1 or 2 schedules on each table. We just didn't make enough for everybody. But the plan is to start at 10 o'clock, so that if there's some ice on the roads, it'll have a chance for the sun to shine and people to feel more comfortable getting here. And then we've just modified the schedule so it will go flowing right along. So basically what you need to know is that it starts at 10 and ends at 4. And because this is a university, if the university is closed, we can't be here. So that's one reason why we're going to go ahead and start at 10, because there's a possibility that the university might have a late start as well. And if it starts later than 10, we will let you know, basically by email. So if we've got your email, that's great. If we don't have your email, the students at the registration desk can take your email. And if there's any uncertainty about it, if you go to the UNCG website, they will have the latest information. So as long as the university is open at 10, we will be starting at 10.
We can also post on the Innovations Conference Facebook.
Right, but if you go to the UNCG website, it will automatically be most up to date. If the university doesn't start until 11, we will still have the conference at 11, and it will end at 4. If it opens at noon, we will still have the conference, and it will end at 4. So we have these contingency plans, but hopefully everything will be fine, and we'll just start at 10 o'clock. And if you have any questions, you can talk to me or one of the students in the back. So thank you very much for your patience about this. I forgot the most important thing. I really want to say a word of thanks to Lori Olson, who has been the coordinator of our conference this year. And she has just worked really hard and has done a super job under some difficult family circumstances. And I'd like for us to give her a round of applause. We have a gift certificate for you to a spa that you can enjoy later.
Does that mean I don't have to come tomorrow?
No spa. It won't be good until a week from now.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Carolina Alzuru, and I am the Prevention Coordinator with the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker. Jen Counts is going to be speaking about a brand new tool that we are getting ready to release at the Coalition that's really exciting. So I hope that you all will be just as excited as we are about it. All right, so Jen Counts is the Prevention Program Specialist for NCCADV. In this role, she provides technical assistance and develops research-based tools and trainings to facilitate primary prevention of domestic violence. Prior to joining NCCADV full-time, Jen worked as Prevention and Evaluation Fellow at NCCADV, completing projects focused on the social determinants of domestic violence. She also conducted assessment and evaluation projects for the Injury and Violence Prevention Branch of the North Carolina Division of Public Health and contributed to domestic violence-related research projects at the UNC Gillig School of Public Health. She has extensive experience in program management and several years of experience volunteering in domestic violence and sexual assault response. Jen earned her Master's of Public Health from the UNC Chapel Hill Department of Health Behavior. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you, Laureen and Paige, and everyone who's taken part in organizing this wonderful event. I think we should give them one more round of applause for everyone who worked so hard to make this happen. And being so flexible with the weather. I know it's been stressful. during this conference. Mark brought it up during his TED Talk, and it came up again, talking about worry and taking risks. And I was just reading an article recently about this anxiety, and especially among people who are working in a field where the goal is to change the status quo, and to break down barriers. And I thought this author was so brilliant when he said, if you're not feeling anxiety, if you're not feeling really uncomfortable sometimes about what you're doing, then you're not doing it right. So it's good that a lot of people in this room are taking risks and are feeling nervous and are feeling anxiety, because that's a good sign that we are maybe ruffling some feathers and making some change in the world. All right, so as Carolina said, I'm here today to introduce a tool that we hope will be incredibly useful for those of you who are practicing violence prevention across the state of North Carolina. This has been a tool that's been a long time in the making, and I'm so delighted to be here today to be able to introduce it, especially at this conference, because it does deal with shared risk and protection. So even though this is kind of a large group in a big room, I really like to make things as interactive as possible when I present. There are going to be several chances for you to interact throughout the presentation, to participate, so I'm counting on at least a few of you to be willing to make yourselves heard. And since this is kind of a large room, we're going to try something a little new to me at least. It may not be new to many of you, but we are going to do some live polling during this presentation. So this means, for once, you are fully encouraged to get out your phones, to get out your laptops, and be on them while I'm talking. Now, of course, you should only be responding to the polls and not, tweeting, but that's another story. So what's going to happen is I'm going to pose a few questions to you throughout the presentation, and I'm going to ask for you to respond either on your laptop or on your phone. Now, if you're using your laptop, you're going to need to be connected to the wireless server at this point. If you're not already connected, I recommend just using your phone or sitting this one out. We're going to go ahead and get started with a polling question now to give everyone a chance to get comfortable with the process before I actually launch into the presentation. All right, so please note, one important note, we are a nonprofit at NCCADV, so that being said, we could not upgrade to allow me the feature to moderate your responses, so keep it clean, please. Anything you type is going to show up on this screen. Just going to put that warning out there in advance. All right, there are no charges to participate when you text, by the way. So since we'll be spending the next hour talking about violence prevention, I wanted to begin by gauging how you all in this room feel about violence prevention. So if you would please, if you've got your laptops out, go to the URL that's listed at the top of the screen. If you've got your phones out, you're going to want to text to the number 22333 and input my username, which is Jennifer Cowan 324. You're going to get a reply message, and then you will be able to send that one word back about how you feel about violence prevention. And as people start responding, we'll start to see words popping up on this screen. So I'll give it a minute for some of you to reply. Okay, overwhelmed?
Does it have to be in all caps the way it is here?
It shouldn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be.
Essential, great. Oh. Growing, absolutely. I'm glad someone mentioned that word because it's going to come up again during the presentation. Hopeful. Great. So we see a range of responses here, right? There's another hopeful. From folks who are feeling overwhelmed and maybe a little bit stressed and irritated by this idea of prevention, to those of you who are excited about it and hopeful about it. All right. Well, thanks so much for doing this for me. We're going to keep track of all these responses, and it's going to help us moving forward to understand where we're coming from as a group around prevention. So as new polls come up throughout the presentation, you should be able to just text in your one-word response, and you shouldn't have to go through the process of logging in again. So, Dr. Deborah Prothero-Stiff, a giant in the field of violence prevention, said in a brief recently released by researchers at CDC, gang violence is connected to bullying, is connected to school violence, is connected to elder abuse, is connected to intimate partner violence, is connected to child abuse, is connected to elder abuse. It's all connected. Prothero-Stiff, after years of experience in the ER and in public health practice and research, is absolutely committed to this idea that not only is violence connected, but to eliminate it, we must be connected in our efforts to prevent violence. So those connections are certainly part of why we are sitting here today at the Innovations in Domestic and Sexual Violence Conference. Because folks in this room have long acknowledged that although domestic violence and sexual violence are two separate forms of violence, there are lots that they share in common, right? So therefore, this opportunity exists to really leverage this partnership, and as I hopefully will make the case today, cast an even wider net to folks working on other forms of violence prevention, and those folks out there who are working on violence prevention but may not even realize it yet. So let's see a show of hands. How many of you in this room want your work to just have an impact on domestic violence? Nothing else. All right. How about just sexual violence? How about both? Some more hands going up. All right. Now, how many of you would like to see your work have an impact not just on domestic violence and sexual violence, but on gang violence, on bullying, on school violence, on intimate partner violence, on child abuse, elder abuse? All right, great. All right, friendly crowd here. Well, you're in luck. And as I've seen already today throughout the great presentations here at the conference, in many ways you're 10 steps ahead of me. Because research, this great research that's happening, continues to confirm what those of you who practice violence prevention every day, and response too, know intuitively and through your experience to be true, that many forms of violence are connected. They share common influences and even underlying causes. And what's more, a number of positive influences or conditions can protect against these forms of violence. These factors, these conditions, these influences present us a golden opportunity to understand why violence does or does not occur, as well as to guide strategies to simultaneously prevent multiple forms of violence. So we're going to spend just a brief second talking about how public health thinks about prevention broadly, because Jen Grove this morning was so kind to set this up for all of us and to talk about the 3 levels of prevention and all of those great models that we use in public health to think about how we prevent violence. And then, once we make sure that we've got that base established, we're going to home in on risk and protective factors, which is what this project is really about. So if we start in the middle of this timeline of prevention, we see violence. In public health and in other fields, we like to think of 3 types of prevention. All right, so secondary and tertiary are those forms of prevention that come after violence. We sometimes refer to them as response. And primary prevention, which is what we're really going to be spending most of the hour today talking about, is what happens before violence occurs. It's what happens before we even see violence. It's done to stop violence before it ever happens. Now, I want to be clear. When we're talking about primary prevention, we are not talking about awareness raising, all right? Awareness raising is a critical first step to readying the community to really hear and respond to the message and to get involved and to get on board with your prevention efforts. But primary prevention actually takes the critical next step after you've raised that awareness to begin to change those existing conditions and behaviors and to really bring the community in after their awareness is raised to help you build an effective program. So the ability to effectively carry out primary prevention basically boils down to our capacity and our willingness to respond to these two essential questions. Why does violence occur? And how do we keep it from happening? Well, this is where risk and protective factors come in. Risk and protective factors can help us find the answers to these two questions. They can be used both to identify priority audiences and conditions to address with our prevention efforts, and to help us develop really relevant prevention strategies. So, anyone in the audience want to be brave and stand up and shout out what a risk factor is? Define what risk factors are for us.
Something that increases the likelihood of victimization.
Perfect. And what else does it increase the likelihood of in addition to victimization? Perpetration. Brilliant. So risk factors, just like she said, increase the likelihood of experiencing an adverse outcome. Now, these risk factors can be found in individuals, in interactions between individuals, within communities, and at the societal level. So think things like harmful gender norms. All right, protective factors. These are the characteristics or conditions or experiences or behaviors that decrease the likelihood of an adverse outcome or reduce the effects of a risk factor. Again, these can be found at all levels of that social ecology, within individuals, between individuals, at the societal level. Think health-promoting policies as an example of a protective factor at that outer level. Some important things to keep in mind about risk factors. They're not determinative, all right? This is very important. They're not determinative. When we say that someone has a risk factor, that means there's simply a change in the likelihood of experiencing violence. It does not guarantee an individual will or will not experience violence. They don't all exert equal influence on our violence outcome. Some risk and protective factors are much more closely related to the violence outcome. For example, the CDC cites the experience of emotional abuse as being one of the most important risk factors for perpetration of intimate partner violence. They're not all changeable. So an experience of emotional abuse, unfortunately, cannot be changed. We can't go back and rewrite history. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore these factors. They can provide important clues about who we need to focus our prevention efforts on, be they primary or secondary. They're additive or cumulative, which is to say that the more risk factors a person has for an outcome, the more likely they are to experience that outcome. Likewise, the more protective factors a person has for violence, for example, the less likely he or she is to experience violence. And when I say experience, again, I'm talking about victimization and perpetration. Finally, some risk and protective factors, those we call shared risk and protective factors, are associated with multiple forms of violence. This is the thrust of the project that we have been working on and that we're introducing here today. So focusing on these shared risk and protective factors gives us a lot of advantages. It's likely to increase opportunities for new partnerships, allow advocates and practitioners to make the most of those really limited prevention resources we know we all have. It acknowledges the complex reality in which violence takes place. Violence does not occur in a vacuum. There are all kinds of influences and conditions on whether or not violence happens. It increases the availability of program and strategy options. We've already seen today, violence prevention strategies look very different. There are many different types of examples of violence prevention strategies. But probably the most important thing that working on shared risk and protective factors does is it ensures that our prevention work will affect more than one outcome, which increases the impact of our work. And in public health, we love to talk about impact because our goal is to have as great of an impact on this public health problem as possible. All right, so now that we've set the stage for talking about the project, well, let's talk about it. First, a brief history of the project. It all began in a covered wagon. Okay, well, it's been several years in the making, and some of the folks in this room who were involved in the beginning stages of it probably feel like it did begin in the covered wagon, right? Actually, in 2009, the North Carolina Division of Public Health, the Injury and Violence Prevention Branch, published a 5-year plan to reduce the burden of injury and violence in the state of North Carolina. So this plan specified the need to define, provide data, and recommend strategies to address the following 5 prioritized violence outcomes: child maltreatment, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, suicide, and youth violence. So with the increasing recognition of the links between each of these forms of violence, the team that was implementing the plan, which included our beloved Catherine Guerrero and Jen Chavaznik, among other fantastic child maltreatment folks, youth violence folks, and suicide prevention folks, really chose to grant special attention to those strategies that are capable of influencing more than one violence outcome. Because such strategies, as we know, are more likely to maximize the use of our available resources, foster new partnerships, and increase our impact. You're going to hear me say these things multiple times over the course of the next hour. So this website is a product of that effort that started back in 2009. And it's just barely 2015, so we're still on track for that 5-year goal. So currently this project is CDC funded. The specific grant funding this project is called Delta Focus. For those of you who aren't familiar with Delta Focus, the emphasis of this grant is on developing domestic violence prevention strategies at the outer layers of the social ecological model, which is another way we think about increasing the impact of our public health work. So the goal is to move violence prevention beyond the individual relationship level strategies that we tend to rely on pretty heavily out to the outer layers, where we're actually creating healthier social and physical contexts in which people live. And actually, CDC and SAMHSA and many other funders are increasingly looking for prevention proposals to develop just these types of higher level strategies, as well as incorporate collaborative work around shared risk and protective factors. So the methods that we've used to develop this site are described in great detail, and I won't spend a lot of time on them here, but I will say that the project started with a literature review to identify those risk and protective factors that were shared by those 5 prioritized forms of violence. Now, about the time we were wrapping up our own literature review, the CDC released this Connecting the Dots brief that we've heard so much about already today, and that we're going to talk about some more this afternoon. And this contained a matrix of shared risk and protective factors for 8 different forms of violence, including, conveniently, North Carolina's 5 prioritized forms of violence. So we'll take a look at their findings in just a moment, and which affirmed ours. So the methods also include interviews with state and local practitioners, the development of strategy or criteria inclusion, internet searches for strategies, programs, and resources, the development of case studies that feature innovative local programs, and the creation of a map that pinpoints prevention programs happening around the state. And we'll talk about each of these features more momentarily. First, I'd like to do a quick show of hands. Who has seen the CDC Connecting the Dots brief on shared risk and protective factors, or if you've read it or are familiar with it, will you put your hands up in the air? Okay, so maybe about half of us. Great, that's exciting. This is a really cool publication that I recommend everyone take a moment to look at. It's pretty short, so it shouldn't take too long. We're going to kind of breeze through some of the tables today that are more pertinent for this project, but again, it's available on the CDC website, and I highly recommend checking it out. All right, so what the brief does is it looks, again, like I said, at the 8 violence outcomes and all those risk and protective factors that are shared among them. And they do something really cool, at least in my geeky public health brain. They organize these shared risk and protective factors both by whether or not they're risk or protective, and also by which layer of the social ecology they belong in. So you can see here, they have a list of neighborhood level risk factors associated with each of the forms of violence. Now, factors are in the far left column, and the forms of violence are in the columns across the top. And everywhere you see an X, that is where research has been done to show a connection between that risk factor and that violence outcome. Now, just because there isn't an X there, doesn't mean that is not a risk factor for that type of violence. It simply means there is no research right now that can confirm that connection. But a lot of us in this room probably see things up there that should have X's in them based on our experience. So we're going to talk a little bit about lack of economic opportunities at the neighborhood level this afternoon, because we have some great examples from around the state where folks are working to increase economic opportunities. You can see it's connected to all kinds of forms of violence. Here's neighborhood protective factors. Same setup. One that I want you to pay close attention to is community support and connectedness. All right, again, a lot of great work going on around community support and connectedness. We've heard about it in this room. It's going on all over North Carolina, and we probably don't even know about half of it. Societal risk factors. No surprise to anyone here, harmful gender norms. Look at that, associated with almost every single one of their forms of violence. And finally, relationship level risk factors. We're going to talk about poor parent-child relationships, which, as you can see, are very influential in whether or not violence develops. Okay, so time for our second poll. What is the biggest barrier your organization faces to doing the prevention work it wants to do? Funding, money, funding, resources, people power, time. Yep, absolutely. Okay. And this certainly reflects what we hear when we go out across the state and we're talking to local programs about prevention and what those barriers are that they have to overcome before they really feel prepared to engage in a comprehensive prevention plan. All right, and I wish I had lots of money to give out today, but as you'll see in the website, we do have a section within our resources that will point you toward funding sources that have grants and money available to support work around specific shared risk and protective factors that we highlight in the website. And some of these are even local and state specific, which I think is really cool. So, now for the website. Prevent Violence NC is what we have chosen to call it. I hope you all agree that it's an appropriate name for this project. Before we take a look at what the website looks like, I want to provide a little bit of context. So one way to do this is to demonstrate how this website or this tool fits into the process of developing a prevention program around risk and protection. So using the CDC's public health approach to violence prevention, first you're down here in the lower left-hand corner, you're figuring out exactly what the problem is in your community, what the scope of the problem is, and then you're moving up to risk and protective factors. What are the most important influences in your community on this problem? Now, we don't have a lot of time today to talk at length about building a program. This is a topic that we can and certainly do cover in other prevention trainings. But one important thing to say here is that prevention programs must be relevant for the communities in which they're rooted. It's not just about picking any risk and protective factor out of that table that I showed you a moment ago. It's about determining the characteristics, the needs, the strengths of your community. Well, how do you go about doing that? You do that by looking at your data, by talking to people, by working in the communities for years and years. The community health assessment is a great place to start. Every health department in North Carolina is required to do regular community health assessments. If you haven't gone online to check out your community's health assessment, I highly recommend you do that. There's a lot of great information there. So the Prevent Violence NC tool comes in after you've done this measurement of what's going on in your community. All right, so right here in between identifying the risk and protective factors and developing your prevention strategies. It's not intended to replace your community health assessment or other efforts to understand what risk and protective factors are relevant in your community. That step is the first step you need to take. And this tool is not intended to replace the myriad databases of evidence-based programs and strategies that are out there already. This is a decision-making tool. Our niche is that we're trying to help programs select the best interventions that are applicable and relevant for their community needs, connect them to other prevention efforts that are happening either within their community or around the state, and expand this notion of what constitutes violence prevention. Now, all of this is an effort to increase coordination and to ensure that programs are comprehensive in the way that they're implemented, in terms of addressing multiple layers of the social ecology, in terms of addressing multiple developmental stages throughout life, and clearly, in terms of addressing multiple forms of violence and other health outcomes. All right, and here is the site. Ta-da! Thank you, Lori. We're looking here at a mock-up of the home page, which is still being built, so you'll see some weird Latin phrases in here. But what I hope that you'll notice right off the bat is that we really wanted this website and this project to have a positive, uplifting look and feel, and we've chosen to emphasize growth throughout. Growth of individual, family, and community strengths, growth of the set of people and organizations who are working to prevent violence, growth of new partnerships, and growth of the resources available to support this critical work. So to this end, we've designed the site to increase coordination of evidence-based and evidence-informed primary prevention of violence, focused on those shared risk and protective factors with special emphasis